for folks to use them, and it's even easier to begin to tie together these different strings of the impacts of the way our city has developed and manifested. So education implications, investment implications, and then hopefully we'll have a lot of time for Q&A and can dig a lot deeper into all of this. So I have a twofold purpose here. First, I want to define and explain this concept of uneven development and define it in the context of Memphis and what it means for, again, broadly defined smart cities, right? So when I'm saying smart cities, what I really mean is anything that really has come to bear in the last, let's say 10 to 20 years, that is intended to make cities more efficient, more effective at service delivery, autonomous vehicles, right? A lot of the things that we think about when we think of the future city, right? What are the data and tech tools? And really use this concept of uneven development to wrestle with what that means, right? If we're applying smart city ideology and data and technology to a system that already is broken in a lot of ways, right? It already has systemic inequities really baked into the built environment. What does that mean for the way that those data and technology ideas are then, applied to the city itself? And then secondly, I want to provide various examples of data-driven ways to analyze and highlight key forces that reinforce this, but also, I didn't spell this out on the slide, but in addition to highlighting the forces, also highlighting them in a way that lends itself towards a solution. So I think in a lot of ways, when you share data with residents and community members about their neighborhood, and you give them things like the poverty rate, you give them things like the vacancy rate, the likelihood of going to college or getting being gainfully employed. When you go through these litany of data sets, folks who are living in that community and residents that are living in that neighborhood, you're not telling them anything they don't already know through the lived experience, right? But I think what it does, and what I want to really make an argument for, is it allows those residents then to own the data and to have power of the narrative that they create with that information, right? There's a famous, well, everything's attributed to Mark Twain. I don't know if it's actually, there's 3 lies, right? Lies, damn lies, statistics. Data can really tell you anything you want it to tell you. And I think the argument I'm making is if we can leverage the momentum and really the interest in data and technology and use that power to harness it as a leveling force within our inequitable, by any definition, right, inequitable urban system, that is giving people what they need to live a quality life. Memphis and many urban cities aren't doing that well right now. And so how can we leverage this power to make it more about smart cities, but also to have a conversation about smart citizens and foregrounding the individual and the end user as opposed to the corporation. That's kind of part 2 here. Let's start by defining what I mean when I say uneven development, right? I don't know if we have any geographer students either on Zoom or in the audience today, but this is a term that was really coined by critical geographers in the 80s and then the decades that followed to essentially, a lot of critical geographers at that time were looking at New York City in the 1980s, and they were trying to reconcile the aftermath of the systemic disinvestment by the 60s and 70s, really the 70s in particular, where New York and every city in America was going to be left for dead, and there was clearly unprecedented amounts of disinvestment and vacancy and abandonment. But at the same time, even in the early to mid 80s, you were also beginning to see signs of early gentrification and early reinvestment and people moving back to certain parts of the city. Definitely as the 90s and 2000s grew, that became more of a dichotomy. So how do geographers and other social scientists like myself as more of an interdisciplinary urban studies guy, how do we reconcile these two realities? And I think Memphis today, when I look at Memphis in 2021, in a lot of ways, the pandemic is only beginning, like most things, is only making the realities of uneven development more stark and more noticeable. Specifically when we look at issues of housing and tenants' rights and the renters and owners and in my world, I deal a lot with housing, and we look at the patterns from 2008 to 2010, and then selling off, droves of bad loans and bad mortgages from the banks that were left with them, that were left holding those loans, to Wall Street investors in the 2011, 2012, 2013, and how that essentially created a city that is one of the fastest growing rental housing markets in the country now. And so those decisions, all contribute, and I'll go through them in more detail, but all of these decisions create a situation where a lot of times when you're in Memphis and in cities like it, but certainly Memphis, you hear folks say, one street over, right? Or stay on this side, or don't, make sure you don't go into that side of the neighborhood, right? We kind of use these broad, crude geographies, these, pretty, I would say, pretty intentional and unintentionally, pretty racist ideologies of understanding our city and thinking about how the different neighborhoods how we hold all of those together. And so basically, one way to think about uneven development is, how did Memphis get to look the way it does today? And what are those systems, policies, and interventions that continue to reinforce that? So we're going to go kind of on a quick history trip here. I'm going to kind of walk us through at a really high level. We can get into a lot more detail, but the main point I want to make on this slide, right? Redlining has gotten tons of attention. On the next slide, I'll go into more detail about a really cool data analysis and mapping program at University of Richmond, where they've digitized all of the redlining maps and also projects of urban renewal, which is on the far right here. This is a view of Crump Avenue in the late 1960s as the federal urban renewal programs were underway and going into Beale Street downtown. That's to the right. The image you see in the middle, and this is why I really like to say it's more than just redlining, right? In the middle, this is actually a deed, a copy of a deed, I want to say from the 1930s in Memphis, Tennessee, that you can't really see the text that well, but it was a racial covenant, right? So there were deeds like this at the property level that essentially said only people of certain ancestry and race and ethnicity can live at this specific house, and it barred any Black African American household from purchasing that property and moving in. And these were illegal legal for a while. Early part of the 1900s until the 1920s and 30s, there was the NAACP, when it was just getting started. One of their big legal wins was striking down this racial deed, these deed covenants, you'll hear them called. But today, even today in Memphis, you can go on to the Register of Deeds site. You can pull addresses that would have been built or sold in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and you can find, the early remnants of zoning in Memphis was, and in many cities, but especially Memphis, was meant to reinforce racial neighborhood patterns, right? And then, of course, on the far left, kind of went backwards here, but I think most folks, if you know about sort of tools that were used to racially segregate communities in the early 20th century, you certainly heard the redlining map, but that is the exact map for Memphis from the New Deal era that was originally written to be a foreclosure mitigation strategy, right? So much like 2008, the Great Depression also had a housing component and was very detrimental to communities and to neighborhoods, and the Roosevelt administration had their own version, the Home Ownership Loan Corporation, HOLC for short. They were wanting to go in and find which loans they could quote unquote salvage, right? What were the neighborhoods where it was worth salvaging loans with limited federal funding? And maps like these were produced, and then were the real systemic aspect of the redlining map. The map by itself in the 30s did little, but it really became law of the land when the Federal Housing Administration, the subsequent, what the Home Ownership Loan Corporation turned into, when FHA used a similar version of these same maps to determine where they would give federally backed subsidized loans and to whom they would give federally subsidized backed loans, essentially giving most upwardly mobile white families an exit ramp out of neighborhoods that were already in the process of being disinvested intentionally. So, so that's sort of the background. But now I want to touch on pull some screenshots, and I'm happy to share links after the talk. But there was a group at the University of Richmond called Mapping Inequality, where they've done two things. So they've dug through the National Archives to get as many bulk maps at the city level as you can. You see that at the far left, they have them all over the country. They just got Memphis up a couple years ago, but pretty much any major city in the United States, you can go just like we did for our city and see that detail. But then they also looked a lot at urban renewal specifically, and which projects were marked for urban renewal in a city, how many families were displaced by those projects. So in a lot of cases, in Memphis specifically, we had a unique spin on urban renewal here because we announced the Beale Street urban renewal project a week after Martin Luther King was assassinated. So in April of 1968, as the city was still reeling from the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, the federal government and local government announced that they were going to bulldoze most of what was essentially Black Wall Street at that time in Memphis. Beale Street was the hub of Black businesses and wealth. And, the first Black millionaire, Robert Church, called that neighborhood home. And so we bulldozed that and made way for the tourist commercial district we know of Beale Street now today. But I think either way, tools like these do a really good job of showing how data can be used to, with a fine-tooth comb and with as much evidence as possible, show the intentional decisions that were made to sort of bake urban inequities into our cities. Moving through the century here a little bit and getting a little into the next sort of phase of growth and change that impacted the way Memphis looks today. This is probably the one we're most familiar with, right? This is a map I actually pulled from the Center for Applied Earth Sciences and Engineering Research, CSER for short. I think it describes it really well. I'm pretty sure they created these when they were helping out with Memphis 3.0, the city's comprehensive plan. But I think it shows better than anything I've ever seen, just the extent to which our populations did everything they could to get out of the city from 1970 on. And so when we talk about vacancy, when we talk about disinvestment, when we talk about urban inequities, I think Memphis making a decision to go from a 200 square mile city to a 323 square mile city, size of Orlando, Seattle, and Atlanta, city properties all combined. And then the Federal Highway Administration Act, the interstates that were built, most cases in Memphis, directly through Black neighborhoods, and directly through most neighborhoods, with the exception of Overton Park. That's a well-known local story. The white neighborhood came together and was able to fight off the highway administration. Black communities were not oftentimes afforded the same opportunity. And so now, I think this was sort of step two. If we're beginning to already bake in residential segregation, this took what we were seeing essentially within the parkways for the early part of the century and expanded it all the way almost through most parts of the county, as we see in 2010, and really impacting that urban core part of Memphis. And again, just reinforcing a lot of those red neighborhoods we saw in the redlining map and the neighborhoods that were targeted with urban renewal. Now, both, and it's not just white families. A lot of time we talk about white flight, but I think in Memphis, given the strong Black middle class that the city has had historically, there was also a lot of Black households that left these neighborhoods as well, and left the housing stock in a way where even if future generations want to go back into the community, want to go and live in the areas that were raised, it's much easier said than done, given just the pervasive amount of what I was sort of referred to as hyper vacancy. So not just a vacant property for a month until you get a tenant in there, but vacant properties that stay there for 6 months, a year, 5, 6 years, and really begin to weigh on city services and neighborhoods, and make it hard to rebuild. Now, wrapping up the sort of how we got here piece before we get into the health implications. This is sort of what's happened since 2000. So obviously the graph to the left was created for the State of Housing Report. We did in 2020, and it just maps that red line. I know you guys might not be able to see it that well, especially not on Zoom, but the red line shows foreclosures, and the yellow shows vacant units. And you can see as foreclosures go up, vacant units rise right in tandem. And then the far end of that, I mentioned earlier in the talk, the impacts of private equity groups, buying up a lot of property. When we look at the data, we see that from 2006 to 2014, Memphis, and that's what this next graph shows, Memphis has lost more affordable rental units than any other city in the Southeast. So this includes Nashville, this includes Atlanta, this includes Birmingham. And while these other cities, Tampa, these other cities have lost their affordability from the top of the market, right? Things getting more expensive, at least prior to COVID. COVID's changed a lot of these the home prices. But Memphis, in many ways, it's the exact opposite, right? As these private corporations and as a lot of vacant units that were foreclosed on during the foreclosure crisis, as they maybe haven't come back online, it's created a situation where our housing stock is being squeezed sort of from both ends in a lot of ways. Whereas in most cases, in your Atlantas and your Nashvilles and your Miamis and your Tampas, they're mainly just top of market affordable homes, right? And then obviously COVID impacts a lot of this, and we're seeing calls for we buy house groups. We're seeing predatory rent to own schemes called contract for deed, where you think you're renting to one day own, but in the fine print you're just perpetually renting, and you're left with the responsibilities of an owner with other benefits. So all of these things really compound together to create sort of the uneven, inequitable Memphis that many of the neighborhoods experience today. Now we're going to sort of talk through that on three straight lenses. I'm going to go a little bit quicker through this, but I definitely want to spend time talking about the tool. So I'm sure a lot of public health folks and others familiar with open data sources for health are familiar with the screen to the left. This is the Center for Disease Control's 500 cities data set. To my knowledge, and I love public health folks to provide more detail on this because I'm kind of skating on thin ice here. This isn't really my direct field, but to my knowledge, is one of the most granular data set sources that we've had that gets to the track level on things like I think hypertension, obviously cancer rate, life expectancy, exposure to environmental illnesses like asthma prevalence map to the right, and on a myriad of health indicators. It lets you know what that data looks like at a very, very local level. Memphis is one of the 500 cities included, but that opens up a lot of possibilities on the health side to really, again, tell us what the reality of a lot of these families are living on the ground, but also create a situation where we can layer in to the right. This project was done by a colleague of mine at the University of Memphis Science Center, where they mapped asthma prevalence and vacant abandoned properties. And you can see how asthma prevalence and vacant abandoned properties were essentially the same map, right? Which is a lot of what we're talking about here. The implications of uneven development show themselves in health, in education, in green space and canopy. And by having data like we have to the left, it allows us to understand what other connections that we can make and gain a greater understanding. Right? Knowing the life expectancy in South Memphis is less than it is in East Memphis doesn't tell us a whole lot that we already didn't know. But if we can layer in and look at how asthma rates impact educational outcomes or impact the job access, right, transportation, right, it really begins to create a more systemic picture of what uneven development looks like here in Memphis. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time moving to the education piece. The two pictures to the left, top left is a national data set, and then bottom left is a EdGap that was created by a local education nonprofit, Memphis Teacher Residency, where they map ACT scores to the school. And then I think that is over the amount of residents in that population that are going to a private school. So it's private school student population mapped with ACT scores. And I thought it was really interesting because you can tell the darker areas and all the ACT scores, by the way, are all for the public schools. So even in areas where populations have access to private schools, they also seem to have access to the best public schools as well. So, you know, the average ACT score is 26, 20, 25, 23, which has been a while since I've taken ACT, but I'm pretty sure those are solid scores. And you can also do the same for SAT. So I think that's a really cool tool. And then sort of the holy grail of national education, public education data set is the NCES, National Center for Education Statistics. This has high school graduation rates, enrollment rates, school closure information for pretty much any public school in the country. And it does a really good job of allowing, you know, school quality is a moving target, really difficult to nail down for a lot of education analysts and sellers. And I don't think this does as good as any tool allows us to really see what the impacts of these different education reforms that we're doing. Right, Memphis kind of builds itself and brands itself as the education reform capital of the world. What does that look like in action, and how does that actually impact the schools that many Memphians are still attending? And then the one to the right is an interesting example. It's not from Memphis. You can probably already tell from the map, but it's actually a study that was done by a couple of researchers in Atlanta, where they looked at the metro Atlanta area and specifically identified where students were going to school, where they were living, and then the racial compositions of those neighborhoods. And the pink lines, you know how well you can see them, the pink and dark blue lines essentially are what they're calling a racial border, right? So we talked earlier about uneven development. If you live on this side of the street, you go to this school and you have this life. If you live on this side of the street. And so what they did is, using all publicly available information for the metro Atlanta area, they said these are the areas where, and they're hoping to replicate this in other cities, these are the areas where that street really is a divide, right? These are the borders of uneven development in Atlanta, and this is what it means for our students, and this is what it means for the education. And so there's a group working on applying that same sort of thinking and methodology to Memphis, and releasing a public tool that will come with it. But again, I use it as an example to show ways we can leverage public data, leverage tools like NCES and EdGap to tell us some stuff that we may know, folks living on the ground may know, but it puts it in a way where now we can design policy, now we can design interventions. Once we see and put it in stark terms, these are the lines, these are the borders of racial communities. It allows us to think more towards a solution in a lot of ways. Okay, last but not least, I want to scale it out a little and talk about investment patterns. So the map on the left is another tool. This is a local one from the city of Memphis. They have been working really hard, the Office of Performance Management in the city, to digitize and create public data sets for different departments in the city government. What I have mapped there is the community development block grant investments. Every dollar, there are dollars that flow from the federal government, come through the state, and are one of the most flexible community development spending resources that any city has access to. And there has been, Representative Cohen has been pushing for a bill that would expand the allocation that Memphis gets. The formula where we're getting, far less than cities like Detroit or Baltimore because of the size of our city. And but this does a really good job of showing where the city over the last 11 years since 2010 has been putting those federal dollars, what neighborhoods, what projects, what for, and really allowing, in one of our most consistent and sustainable funding sources, to understand what that investment has meant for those communities. That really is sort of what we begin to do to the right here. There are two, well, the bottom is really just news coverage for the report on the top, which is just finished cover July 2021 by the Urban Institute, where they looked at HMDA information, Housing Mortgage Disclosure Act, where banks and traditional financial institutions were making mortgages and accessing capital to families, and where those investments were happening and where they weren't. And so the headline for the MLK 50 article covering this report, again, doesn't really tell us anything we don't already know, but it allows us to show it in a way where we can get closer to interventions and policy solutions. And then advocacy as well. I think a lot of folks have, I know a lot of folks in the community development world and neighborhood leaders and neighborhood organizations have been using this information and this reality that this report to push for increased investment of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund locally at the city level, to increase the number of dollars we're putting into projects in communities like this, but also with the Accelerate Memphis program announced, it's $200 million investment is going to be making into neighborhoods across the city. I think is another opportunity for us to remedy some of these systemic inequities that. Okay, I'm going to leave you with 3 closing thoughts. For number 1 here, this is tough, right? This is tough stuff. I do a version of this in my Intro to Urban Studies class, and it roads with undergrads, and I've had multiple times. Students, especially in color, when you lay it out in these harsh terms, I think data is it's a powerful tool, right? But it also is difficult to grapple with, right? And so I think it highlights these harsh realities, and it does so in a way that, and I think this is the benefit to the community, right? So my case, I get into this in my second and third point, but my case for focusing on smart citizens instead of smart cities is allowing the communities that are impacted the most by uneven development, by neighborhood disinvestment, by urban inequity. The communities are impacted the most by the reality of these data, can take control of that information and use it to verify in a sort of what some have dubbed a post-truth world, right? What are facts? I think now more than ever, using objective data sets and data sources to spell things out and really start terms, and being as open and honest with your methodology and your sources and open sourced and your code and all that in a way that makes it harder to dispute. I think that's ultimately the opportunity we have right now in Memphis. Cities like it is for us as we're thinking about smart cities. Is we've done a really good job and spent a lot of time today highlighting the realities of this disinvestment and uneven development. But now what can we do about it? And then last but not least, we want to start this local conversation and not just what we have today, but the thing that excites me is how can we use these data and technology tools? How can we work hand in hand with communities, with CDCs, with neighborhood associations, and put these data on a screen and say, now what? What are we going to do with it? How can we use this information to leverage productive dialogue around potential interventions? So, all right, I think that's all I got. Excited to hear questions from Zoom and person, all that good stuff. Yeah, thank you guys for listening. Appreciate it.
Thank you. We do already have some questions from the Zoom. And the first question is, can you talk about how TIF districts, pilots, and other similar programs are used to address these inequities, and are they effective? Do you encourage using technologies and data to impact and measure change? So I guess 2 questions.
First one, I couldn't give you a whole presentation about the importance of using objective data. I mean, just kind of riff on an answer, but so I'm going to lean on previous research, and specifically around tips, because I know that's a hot topic in pilots as well. But I think most of the research shows, with a tip, and I don't want to get into too much detail here, but urban renewal, I mentioned that it's a well-known federal program. That is actually the reason TIFs were created. The first tax increment financing district was in California in 1953. And it was actually used to fund urban renewal projects. It was a local funding mechanism to match the federal dollars that the federal government was giving for renewal programs. And as the program has evolved, it's really been intended and there's sort of different states. Every state has adopted its own version of TIF enabling legislation. In Tennessee, we didn't pass ours until 1997, the Community Redevelopment Act, where it gives local municipalities the ability to create TIF districts and process for doing that. But there's this ethos, or not really ethos, but more of a guiding principle for TIFs that's called the but-for analysis, right? But for the subsidy, but for these funds that we're giving, and the same can be said for pilots as well. But for the subsidy, this project would not be able to happen. And again, speaking empirically, objectively, passing no judgment of any local actors or any developers or anything. I think that the reality is, and local media has done a good job of highlighting this recently. The pilots that the Downtown Memphis Commission, Edge, and others are giving, and the projects that TIF dollars are going to fund. Grind City Brewery, for example, in Uptown was funded and subsidized by TIF funds. I don't believe it. I didn't look at the pro forma. I don't work for Grind City Brewing, but if you ask me my professional opinion, I have trouble believing that project would not have happened without TIF dollars. Same is true for the walk on Union, right? The big, what is it, millions of dollar development, $100 million development, really big. I think maybe close to $1 billion now. I don't know, but that development's getting a lot of subsidy and a lot of tax breaks from various different lasagna financing, right? And it's and I think that capitalized as they are, and the access to capital they need subsidy. What subsidy is essentially allowing developers to do is garner more of a return than they would have gotten anyway. The project by itself probably would have made them some money. Now they get to make a little more. And I don't think that was the intention. The tip is a different story, but certainly for pilots and other affordable housing tools, the intention wasn't to make money for developers. It was intended to solve uneven development patterns we've seen. And I think the reality is, and it's not just pilots, but if you even go into tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, historic tax credits, we have made providing housing for poor people as complicated as possible. And we've made it as complicated as possible so that select few people can use that. And we professionalized what was essentially, used to be a government service, public housing in its form. Social housing in other countries works really well and is shown to have a number of positive impacts. And I think we've complicated it to a way where those tools don't really solve the problems in the way we would like for them to, or at least my personal, how I would like them to. I won't speak for anybody else. So that's a long-winded answer to number one. I promise number two will be a lot shorter if I can remember it.
I think you already answered it,
Okay,
but
cool.
it was on using technologies and data to, so I think actually the question was, do TIFs, pilots, and other programs use data and technology to measure impact and change?
I'll stay on this a little more, and I promise I'll keep it brief. I would say to varying degrees, I think the answer is yes. I would say that, again, in a lot of cases, the folks that are applying for TIFs, there are different examples, especially recently, you have, Binghamton, community TIF, but in a lot of TIF districts, when they're applying for it, it's done by a developer. So a lot of times developers and proprietary real estate professionals have access to much better data. They're purchasing a proprietary data set from MLSs and banks and real estate providers. Really gets made publicly available. So I would say that they probably do it in a different way, and I think that's sort of why when we're talking about smart cities, we have to have a political economy discussion, right? Who's data for who? Who's controlling it? Who's using it? Who has access to it? And what does that ultimately mean for the result of those communities? So I would say yes, but maybe just not in a bottom-up fashion. It's more in a kind of top-down sort of the folks that have access to it. I wouldn't say it's being the measuring change piece really hasn't been another big opportunity.
Yeah.
It's funny. And I've only been involved in this a little bit, but I could definitely to answer your question. Yes, hopefully not very elite. Had a project with Brookings Institute where they wanted to create inclusive economic indicators. So across, I think they had, the Memphis Chamber, Innovative Memphis, Building Memphis, which is the Community Development Trade Association. They were all working with Brookings, and we just last year wrapped up. These are our indicators. This is the methodology. This is the data we can use. I'll have to check with Innovate to see how public we can make that. I know the intention is to not only make it public, but make it into the property health. But the good news is it actually goes, the indicators we come up with go more granular. Most of the data that we want to look at are the shop. And if there was less, we would aggregate it up with some. But that's definitely there, and I think both from there's sort of like indicators around economic equity, indicators around like community equity, and there are different buckets. But yeah, we definitely give you more information on that. Yeah. I'm going to ask you a question, and locally, but if there is no good example of one that I know elsewhere. But actually, yeah, that's a really good question. I would say to me, or for me at least, the best examples of leveraging data to bring the change we want to see tend to be when data access and these conversations with data and technology overlap with conversations of community organizing and empowerment. And I think that has happened to varying degrees at the local level. At Rhodes College, I'm leading a undergrad class. We're in our second year now. We don't have results yet, so we're not. It hasn't entirely changed yet, but in the Orange Mountain neighborhood, the Orange Mountain community, and organization of Orange Mountain Roads about leading a bottom-up planning initiative for the entire neighborhood. And the selling point to the community in a lot of ways was this is going to be the process. We really figure out what the effort. We followed in the footsteps of the University of Memphis project from South Memphis revitalization. The planning school here worked with led. And so to me, our goal there is to work closely with the community organizing group. We're having street assembly meetings where they're going to be able to watch organization with groups on the ground, hundreds of residents. And this is, the residents are taking control of the data. The road is providing technical expertise needed to locate the data in a way where it is meaningful. This is what we have about our neighborhood. This is what best practices we have. And this is what we want to see happen. How do that play out? Obviously, I spent a lot of time in the housing development space, but what would that look like in education? What would that look like in sort of the health space? imagine what healthcare delivery looks like, using open data. I mean, I think when you detach yourself from sort of the political economy as it's constituted, allow yourself to think about what it would mean if the power and with the hands of the residents also had the data that the system. What would that mean? But to get the question, I think it's obviously this is just the organizing best practice, but they were using data at the time, but it's not, not smart city data, sure, but the Dudley Street neighborhood initiative talked about a lot of it, occurred that day. And they essentially did that, right? They created a bottom-up plan. They knew what there was a hospital that was going to move into the neighborhood and buy a lot of property in the Roxbury neighborhood in Boston, near Roxbury in Boston. They came together and found the data, organized the vision, created models, and now 30 years later, that area, as the rest of Boston, is gentrified like crazy. Like an oasis of preservation in the sea of gentrification, and that was because 40 years ago. So I think that's sort of that's the goal, right? If we can find ways to allow those who are impacted by this to be the ones who are telling us how to get out of it.
Maybe one more. What do you see as the role of universities in addressing equity challenge in Memphis, both from the academic vantage point, but also as large employers and as community players? Just large employers.
So, this as a one thing that I've seen university really well, and University of Memphis does this well also, is using the expertise and access to the data. Right now, I think the reality is there are a lot of folks working to change this, but to really make full use of all of these data sets, really create it and shape it in a way where we can make meaningful decisions. Academic partners definitely, and I think we're using this information to share research and kind of do your research. Academics has a strong role to play in going beyond the borders of its campus and working with communities in a way that it's the residents and citizens in a way that levels the playing field and allows researchers, analysts, and data scientists to not just enrich the students and the classroom, but also leveraging students in the classroom. Like the example with the they have to check this box anyway. How can we get this box checked in a way that may also benefit the community? And may also give resources, family resource organizations. So I'm a firm believer of the economy kind of tearing down the divide between power in the community and as walls, but I think it's still going to data technology place. That's definitely a role. I would say as a large employer, and this is the opportunity for many for the main center. AutoZone, I'm at the University of Memphis. I think in a lot of ways, much like the purpose for the institute, right? For companies and larger employers, have been leveraging these tools and are light years ahead of where we mentioned the remote before the clouds, right? FedEx had remote in a long time ago, right? That's the beginning of that, right? So there's a divide there. And what I would say is much like the academy leverages their resources to level playing field for the community. I think as large employers, many of the corporations and universities they have a responsibility to, FedEx ownership on that. Also, sort of the our institution. Okay, we have already solved this problem, right? We have already created ETL systems for scraping public information and putting it into a dashboard for you or something like that, right? And so how can we leverage those same problem solving skills? I think Microsoft has done a little bit of this too as well. They just recently Microsoft and started to give more investment into groups like Innovators and other sort of data intermediaries that are playing the middle person role between residents and data and technology tools, and seeing that as an investment strategy. So I think we're starting to see larger institutions.
Definitely. Well, they're all related.
Yeah.
Any other questions for audience? Okay, so if that is it, then I think our Zoom has finished asking all of their questions as well. And we would just like to thank Austin Harrison for coming to talk. Thank you so much. Okay, I just had to